Please welcome the Education Director for FDIC and the Editor-in-Chief of Fire Engineering, Bobby Halton.
We gather here today for the 90th time. It is a fire service tradition. Tradition imparts meaning. Meaningfulness provides purpose. Purpose is reflected in duty. We are here today to honor duty. The oldest known written poem is the Epic of Gilgamesh. It's an epic poem written on clay tablets about 4,000 years ago about the adventures of the king of Uruk. The poem tells of Gilgamesh's adventures, of his bravery, as his development as a leader, but most importantly, the poem details his unrelenting efforts to complete his duties, both sacred and ordinary. The poem was written for a reason, to provide an outline for future leaders on the necessity to complete one's duties. And it's not a small matter that the very first written human communication's purpose was to illustrate and express the critical necessity of persons of character and consequence to complete their duties. Today, let's us reflect and recommit ourselves to the completion of our duties, sacred and ordinary. During the Second World War, thousands upon thousands of patriots fought and died to defend their countries and to liberate that of others. They knew it to be their duty. Those that didn't go and fight with bullets and bayonets fought the battle at home, many as firefighters. For example, those of the London Fire Brigade, who suffered a higher casualty rate than any other military unit in World War II. This year, on March the 11th, it was the 100th birthday of Lieutenant Colonel James Maggie Majella, the most decorated officer in the history of the 82nd Airborne. In 1942, Maggie had just graduated from college. The war erupted, so he enlisted. Maggie completed months of intense training and drill in Army Airborne School, the most rigorous training that the Army offered at the time, emphasizing the importance of all the ordinary duties: gear maintenance, crew integrity, physical strength, hygiene, and teamwork. Lieutenant Majella would be involved in intense fighting and wounded in the mountains of Naples. Maggie would take part in the Allied invasion of Anzio and be wounded for a second time. During Operation Market Garden, Maggie and his men found themselves across the Wall River, assigned to secure a heavily defended railway and highway bridge. To do so, the men of H Company and I Company manned 26 canvas-lined rowboats and rowed across the Wall River in broad daylight while intense gunfire was being rained down on them from seasoned German troops. As the boats were being ripped to shreds and the men were being picked off one after another, the determined soldiers continued to row on. Men of faith began praying out loud as artillery shells were crashing all around them. Boats were capsizing. Men were drowning. Yet undaunted, they rode on to the cadence of Hail Mary and Thy will be done. After getting to the shore, Maggie single-handedly takes out a German machine gun nest. He then carries a fellow wounded soldier off the field of battle, all the while firing his rifle to protect him. 3 months later, during the Battle of the Bulge, Maggie and his exhausted men 30 in all, were ordered to take the town of Harrisburg. After trudging for 12 hours in knee-deep snow, they unexpectedly find themselves face to face with 300 German infantry. Maggie, kind of improvising, not a page out of the Army handbook, decides to use the element of surprise and attack, despite 10-1 odds against them. They killed over 100 enemy soldiers, captured another 180. As they continued their efforts to secure the town, a German Mark V tank spots Maggie and his men and starts raining its deadly fire directly on them. Maggie alone runs towards that tank, reaching the tank despite withering machine gun fire trained directly on him. He tosses a grenade from his belt between the tank's tracks. He then climbs onto the top of the Mark V and drops another grenade down the turret, killing the crew, destroying the tank, but most importantly, saving his men. He then reorganized the platoon and followed the enemy into town. Maggie led his men building by building, dodging sniper fire, tossing grenades, close quarter fighting, and successfully routing the Germans and capturing hundreds. For his incredible bravery that day, Maggie was awarded the Silver Star. But awards were not his motivation. That's not what drove him that day. It was the need to complete his duties. It was his love of his fellow soldier and his country. Maggie ended his active duty career as a captain, but he continued in the reserves, and he retired a light bird. He received the Distinguished Service Cross, 2 Silver Stars, 2 Bronze Stars, 2 Purple Hearts, too many awards to mention. Maggie was nominated for the Congressional Medal of Honor. But oddly enough, and my Army friends can help me with this, due to some foobar in the paperwork, he didn't get it. Maggie served for 32 more years in the USAID, in Panama, South Vietnam, and Colombia. Maggie answered his nation's call, and as the Army Airborne say, he went all the way. All the way is about duty. You can't do your duty halfway. You're either all the way or you're not at all. Like you, Maggie understood that by completing his ordinary duties, that allowed his company to be successful, powerful, and resourceful. Like you, the men of H Company understood the importance of completing their duties. They understood the need to complete intense training and thorough drill. They understood the need for unit cohesion and teamwork. But some might say, Chief, that was 1945. This is today. Things are different today. People are different today. They were the greatest generation, and kids today, they're snowflakes. Rubbish! Since the beginning of time, some have cried that the end is near. The last generation is better than this one. Even Plato bemoaned that our best days are behind us, that we've drifted so far from our virtues and our values, that the future is dark, it's bleak, and without hope. And that may be folks' most common reaction, one that's totally understandable. The world to many is a frightening and a fearful place, a place where uncertainty and a fear of the unknown creates a sense of dread, a sense of despair. But fear and fatalism have always been countered by the examples set, by the principles exemplified, by the personal character embraced by those who were compelled at one point or another, like you, to put on a uniform. And by the way they lived their lives, by the choices they made, by the examples they set, provided for us who followed that inspiration, that hope that has allowed us to follow them despite our fear of the future. As such, it is an unquestionable truth that we need not fear for the future of this great nation. We need not fear for the future of the fire service. We need but do our duty and trust in divine providence. As we gather here today, as a community who've answered the call to duty, let's celebrate the qualities and virtues that undergird those in uniform service. Let's revel in natural goodness, in honor, in principles, and morality. And above all, let us honor duty. That sense that compels good men and women in uniform to be forthright and honest. That sense of duty that Seneca said exists in good people when he said, good people will do what they find honorable to do, even if it requires hard work. They'll do it even if it causes them injury. They'll do it even if it will bring them danger. Now, sometime in the summer of 42, as they were preparing for the Allied invasion of North Africa, the then commander, George Patton, wrote the following in his diary. He said, I hope that whatever comes up, I shall be able to do a full duty. If I can do that, I will have nothing more to ask. Fate will deliver what success I shall attain. Patton, above all, had a sense of duty, a sense of understanding, or understanding of personal responsibility. He recognized that for all free citizens, there exists a solemn obligation to complete our duties. Men and women in uniform understand that our forefathers assumed every generation would intuitively accept that every inalienable right has a corresponding duty and obligation. That understanding is essential to the social compact that is America. 20 years after Maggie returned from war, a 15-year-old named Bob Murray was being sworn in as the newest member of the 5 Points Junior Firefighter Program. Now, Bob's dad was a lifetime member. Joining 5 Points was a dream come true. Life in this quintessential Delaware town revolved around community involvement, and of course, the volunteer fire department was the most respected. Bob was a sponge, soaking up all he could about the art and science of firefighting. He reveled in the stories of fires and rescue from his dad and others. He drilled, he trained, he responded, gaining confidence and pride at making a difference in his community. He learned about the power of teamwork and the indispensable necessity of the individual. He became aware of the impact of completing his duties and the meaningfulness of having a purpose in life. 5 years later, now a young man of 19, he heard his nation's call to duty. She was at war, and he felt obliged to answer the call and do his part. In April of 1966, after months of intense training and drill, he was a 20-year-old young nervous soldier joining his company, A Troop, 3rd Squadron, 4th Cavalry, 25th Infantry, who had deployed 6 months earlier to Vietnam. Getting off the transport at Camp Alpha Saigon, Bob assumed his primary duties as a machine gunner on an M113, commonly called a track. Shortly after arrival, Bob earned his nickname, as most good firefighters and soldiers will do. While Bob was clearing a rice paddy one day for mines and other booby traps, a nearby water buffalo took offense to Bob's presence. So it attacked Bob, gored him with its horns, and threw him head over heels into the rice paddy. Bob took offense to being gored and thrown into the rice paddy. So he picked up his rifle and he shot the bastard dead. From that point forward, Bob Bullfighter Murray. Now, the 25th was based in Chu Chi. Combat tours were 3 weeks of nonstop heavy combat duty. A Troop had 5 armored personnel carriers, tracks, and 3 Patton tanks. Their duties included 3 vital and dangerous functions. They performed bunker duty, protecting the hooches and the men. They performed recon and ambush patrol, where 8 men in pairs of 2 would saddle up and go out from dusk till dawn, searching for enemy movement at extreme personal risk. The 3rd duty, convoy and escort patrol, that was the troops' favorite, though nonetheless deadly. There were 2 convoys every day coming up from Saigon to Chu Chi, one going up around 10 a.m. and the other one coming down around 2 p.m. It was the 4th Cav's job to keep that road open. And that meant clearing the road from booby traps and ambush, and also protecting those convoys from ambushes. The soldiers liked that duty because the locals would bring out these sandwiches called banh mi, which were a really welcome relief from sea rations. On March the 5th, 1967, started out like any other day in Vietnam for Bullfighter and his fellow soldiers of the 25th. Today's duty was convoy and escort protection. Now, normally 4 men would man a track, but Bob's company was light on soldiers, so today he only had 3 on his track. To protect the convoy from ambushes and other assaults, the 4th would position themselves along the route at various locations. Intel had it that there was a report it might be an ambush about 10 clicks south of Chu Chi. So Bullfighter and another track were ordered to set up near that location. Bullfighter was in the lead track, and they just pulled off the road, and they were getting into position. The second track came in behind them, but it swung a little wider. It hit a landmine. The explosion was just deafening. Fire and smoke erupted from the second track as this 15-ton vehicle flew into the air, flipped over, and landed on the ground in fire. In horror, Bullfighter's looking on as the fire completely engulfs the entire track, trapping the soldiers inside. Bullfighter began to dismount to go render aid, but gunfire erupted from a VC ambush across the road. Bullfighter's sergeant began returning fire. Bullfighter's training kicked in. Bullfighter's sense of duty kicked in. Bullfighter began running without his flak jacket, without his helmet, towards that burning track to save his friends. Reaching the second track, Bullfighter saw that Sergeant Walter Baylock had been blown clear with total disregard for his own personal safety from potential explosions from rocket-propelled grenades, ammunition, enemy gunfire, and fuel. Bullfighter forced open that upside-down track's door and pulled the other gunner out, dragging him clear from the burning track. Now, it's all heavily involved in fire. He's got small rounds of ammo popping off around him, as well as now the enemy fire trained directly on him from across the road. As Bull runs back to the track to try to free the 19-year-old medic, Dennis Jensen, who had only 1 month in Vietnam from that exploding, burning track. Bullfighter sergeant finally called for air support. Navy Skyriders were quickly on scene, laying down cover fire to protect Bullfighter and the team. Bullfighter freed Dennis and went back to the track, but the fire now had completely engulfed the cab, and Bull was unable to extricate the driver, Don White. The D-Trip gunships arrived. They evacuated the 3 burnt and wounded soldiers that Bull had rescued. Dennis Jensen would die later the next day, as would Sergeant Walter Baylock. The other gunner that Bull pulled out, he survived, and they would be reunited 2 years later in Trenton on riot duty. Bullfighter Murray rotated out of Vietnam shortly after this event and served another 1.5 years in the United States Army. Bull got a standard DD-214 upon his discharge from the Army, but there was never any mention of that day in March of '67. A few months ago, 50 years later, a letter came from the Army telling Bob Bullfighter Murray that he was going to receive the Army Commendation for Valor. Bull never expected a medal or a commendation. Bull ran towards that exploding track because he knew it to be his duty, to complete everything he could to save his friends, his fellow soldiers. Bullfighter knew what he had to do that day. He didn't have to think about it. No one had to order him. He did it intuitively. He did it naturally. It came from drill. It came from training. It came from character. It came from Bullfighter's need to complete his ordinary duties to the best of his ability, and that allowed him to complete his sacred duties. Bullfighter, just like you, is compelled to do good. Bob Bullfighter Murray was who Marcus Aurelius spoke of when he wrote, "Whatever anyone says or does, for my part, I'm bound to the good." The same way an emerald or gold or purple might always proclaim, "Whatever anyone says or does, I must be what I am, and so true to my colors. Interestingly, after the Vietnam War, our common language, which is a tool of perception, changed. There was a departure from a long tradition, and the word duty was subordinated, downplayed. In some agencies, it was eliminated. It was replaced by obscure, undefinable words like selfless service and loyalty. These new words compelled the individual to obey authority, regulations, and superiors, but they did little to build that sense of mutual trust and obligation between the members of teams, such as Maggie and Bullfighter embraced. They changed these words, albeit with the best of intentions, given the prevailing worldview in the 70s, and because they felt that society had so far evolved that the old concept of duty was outdated. Today, it's not fashionable in public to speak of virtues like duty, obligation, fidelity, and responsibility. In fact, there are some who believe that we should restrict ourselves from such discourse. Today, whether it is fashionable or not, just and noble men and women in uniform know that it is critical, not only for us, but for our nation, that we talk about and celebrate morality, that we talk about and celebrate obligation, that we talk about and celebrate patriotism, honor, and devotion to duty. We firefighters who embrace duty as a necessary virtue, we can feel a bit out of place at times, perhaps out of step, perhaps a bit nostalgic. We often feel like the great philosopher Yogi Berra once said, hey, the future ain't what it used to be. For those of us who have earned success and the respect of our fellows in the institutions of uniformed service, it's easy to believe sometimes that the world is upside down. Values, practices, beliefs that we always thought were unassailable have long since lost their vitality. Many things that we thought were inconceivable, impossible, and intrinsically un-American are now universally established. Unquestionable truths that we thought were essential to one's character, such as patriotism, duty, and religion, to some today are considered unnecessary. These assaults make us feel conspicuous and out of step with society. But we never feel that way when we're in a room like this, when we're among one another, our fellow firefighters, our fellow war fighters, our fellow law enforcement officers, our fellow patriots. So one can imagine perhaps that what we firefighters call vintage and character is somehow out of date in modern social circles. But we should take solace because our discomfort comes from the tyranny of the minority, and they foster that tragic practice of the bigotry of low expectations. But you, for who the Epic of Gilgamesh was written, you treasured few, you gathered here today, you have skin in the game. You have real-world experience. You appreciate the value of that dearly won experience. Your critics could never appreciate your achieved skepticism. They're convinced that the absence of evidence is the evidence of absence. Tragically, they actually believe they can predict, and so they do. They substitute skepticism with confidence, assured that their knowledge of the world is correct, and then surprised when it isn't. But we ordinary firefighters who heard that call to duty and felt compelled to put on a uniform, we feel differently. Like Marcus Aurelius, we must be true to our colors. We must be who we are. Like Marcus Aurelius, we are bound to the good. We ordinary firefighters heard nature's call to duty out of respect for the goodness and dignity of each individual. And so we continue that long line of ordinary citizens who heard the call and felt compelled to answer. We must tell our stories. We must tell our stories to provide for those who come after us a foundation like Gilgamesh of honoring and completing our duties with the same level of passion and devotion as our forefathers did, as our brothers did on 9/11. He grew up in the Brooklyn neighborhood of Marine Park, same area where he eventually raised his own 5 kids. Family was his top priority. He was also passionate about the job. Matter of fact, his nickname was Jobs. While fighting a 4-alarm fire in a Brooklyn row house on June 5th, 1998, Jobs heard that a woman was trapped. Without hesitation, Jobs, Lieutenant James Blackmore, and Captain Scott LaPiedra ran into that building to search. Despite a maelstrom of fire, suddenly, without warning, the floor collapsed around them. Jobs said, "My whole body was trapped up to my neck. The fire was roaring all around us. I remember excruciating pain in my ankles, being burned to the bone. And I remember praying out loud, 'God, just let me die bravely.'" Jobs, Lieutenant Blackmore, and Captain LaPiedra were trapped in that hellish inferno for almost a half an hour, burning alive. Jobs prayed the Lord's Prayer out loud. Listening outside, 34 inspired firefighters put it all on the line to save their brothers, and they got them out. Lieutenant Blakemore would die at the scene. Jobs and Captain LaPiedra were rushed in ambulances with terrible burns. Captain LaPiedra died 29 days later. Jobs was burned over 30% of his body, and he was near death for many days. Jobs was in the critical care burn unit for 66 days. Those injuries easily qualified him for a full pension. But after years of painful surgeries, skin grafts, and physical therapy, Lieutenant Timothy Stackpole returned to full duty on March 2001 and was promoted to captain in the FDNY on September the 10th, 2001. Captain Timothy Stackpole was among the first to get to ground zero that day. He led his crew fearlessly into 2 world trade. His brothers from the FDNY would find his body a week later. Timmy Stackpole's foundation, mission, reflects his beliefs. Jobs' own words reflected his beliefs. He said, "It is our God-given mission that in times of trouble, grief, sorrow, trial, and disaster, each of us has an obligation, a duty to reach out and help others in any way we can." That American sense of duty has been embraced as our true colors by firefighters with unbridled enthusiasm for generations after generation. In a determined embrace to complete our duties, the American firefighter today is the highest caliber in our history. They are educated, inspired, they display endless initiative, they are attentive and cheerfully susceptible to discipline. Led well, they will endure extreme hardship, go through hell and high water to complete their duties. Those of you who have chosen to answer the call and wear a uniform are bold yet cautious of our grip on life, liberty, property, and happiness. Those of us who have been humbled by experience, trauma, and struggle, firefighters, soldiers, airmen, sailors, law enforcement, reservists, guardsmen, Marines. As members of those elite communities, we are obligated to be good caretakers of our neighborhoods so that our neighborhoods can be safe and productive, so that our neighborhoods can be incubators of the next generation of firefighters, law enforcement personnel, officers, and patriots. We blessed few, we honored trustees of this amazing heritage. We're a merry band of brothers and sisters who, like Maggie, like Bullfighter, like Jobs, like generations for who the Epic of Gilgamesh was intended, we will never forget our fallen. We will go all the way. We will answer the call. To paraphrase the great Supreme Court Justice Clarence Thomas, we are unapologetically religious, we are unapologetically patriotic, and we are unapologetically dutiful. And those who don't understand us would do well to remember that when we hear words like honor and duty, code and responsibility, fidelity and obligation, that no one has to explain those words to us. We have fought, and our friends have died for those words. We are who we are. We must show our true colors. There may come a day when men like Jobs, Bull, and Maggie are no longer allowed to complete their duties, are no longer allowed to show their true colors, are no longer allowed to be honored in gatherings such as this. But today is not that day. And let there be no mistake about it. We are who we are. We're America's firefighters, true to our colors, bound to the good. It's our purpose. God bless the United States of America, for which we stand.